Hello, and welcome to the August 2020 webinar from Brandwood CKC. I'm TJ Thiel, Consulting Operations Manager and Principal Consultant for Brandwood CKC, and I'll be talking about IVDs today. Title today is Blood, Sweat, and Tears, an update to In Vitro Diagnostics regulatory requirements worldwide. What we are trying to do today is to not only identify and highlight requirements for IVDs, but to discuss the upcoming or recent changes with specific geographies in mind. So with that, let's go to the agenda. Today we're going to talk about and start with an IVD overview. Again, the information here will be basically to identify what the different types of IVDs and how that relates to their classifications. Next, we will go through some key information that is required for IVDs. This information is the basic building blocks for your regulatory documentation or technical documentation that you're going to use for submitting a regulatory application. Next, we'll address some of the key IVD standards. These are the standards that are unique to IVDs that need to be part of your considerations in the design and development process. Finally, we will complete by going through 4 instances or 4 different sets of IVD updates, starting with Australia, then addressing the US updates, European updates, and the rest of the world. Okay, to start off, let's provide an IVD overview. As you can see here, there are several different types of IVDs. In-house IVDs are typically laboratory IVDs that are based on laboratory methods. So they have internal validation and are not typically available for commercial use outside of their own laboratory. Standalone IVDs are those that are created for use outside of a specific laboratory. So they are used by a healthcare professional to diagnose or aid in the diagnosis of a medical condition or disease and require instruments to make that assessment. Point of care IVDs, also called near patient IVDs, are IVDs that don't require a ton of instruments. So you're not going to see laboratory equipment or you're not going to see a ton of reagents that go with these, but they're meant to be done at the patient's side to produce a quick result for diagnosis or treatment or aiding in the diagnosis for a condition or disease. Self-tests are those point-of-care diagnostics that are intended to be used by a naive user, so not a healthcare professional. And I think that's the biggest differentiation here, is that point of care is a near patient, very simple IVD to use, but self-test is putting that in the hands of the end user. So typically not somebody who's going to be a healthcare professional. It's not going to be somebody who's trained in medical or medicine. And so therefore, self-tests have a lot more scrutiny around the usability and how they're being accomplished by that end user. And then finally, we'll talk about companion diagnostics. These are IVDs that are going to inform the requirements for drug treatment. So these would be those IVDs that would tell you whether or not you're getting a suitable amount of a specific pharmaceutical or genetic material as part of your treatment regimen. So, when we think about somebody who's on a long-term drug, needs a test to make sure that it's at the right level, or whether or not the clinician needs to up or reduce that prescription. So based on its types, the classification differences are tied very much into that. Now, what I will say is that overall classification of IVDs, no matter what the geography, are based on 2 assessments. One is their public risk, so whether the disease that's being diagnosed is of a public risk. So if we talk about something like Ebola, HIV, or something that's done for blood screening, it's a higher public risk. So those are higher classifications for those devices. The other component of that is the private risk. So how does it affect the actual end user? So is it providing something that would be a life-threatening disease? If so, that's a higher risk classification. If it's something that is for general wellness and is not going to create a significant event if the diagnosis is incorrect, then it'll be less classification. So with that in mind, there are some general statements we can make about the requirements for each of the types of IVDs we illustrated last. So in-house IVDs, because they are unique to the laboratory and that they do the validation in-house, they're lowest classification. And in some places, they're not even required to go through a registration activity. Standalone IVDs can be all over, can be from those low risk, low public, low private risk to the high public, high private risk. So they can be all, whether it's class 1 through 4, or depending on the system. So they span the range. Point of care IVDs are traditionally low to high risk, again, depending on the disease state to be diagnosed. But you have to have additional use considerations around what other diagnostic information is available. So point of cares are typically not the only information or diagnostic information that is used to make a disease determination. And so they could be used as screening tests or triage tests. Self-tests as a subset or an add-on to the point of care tests, because they're used by naive users, it automatically gives them a higher risk profile than a point of care test, even if it is exactly the same test, because again, you're not dealing with a trained clinical professional who can understand how to use the device, but also to interpret what the results of that device are. And then companion diagnostics are kind of outside of the general classification scope, although they're generally tied to the drug submissions. If they are standalone, it's the classification is really dependent on how it's to be used with the patient in combination with the drug. So we'll go into one of the changes that the TGA has made on the companion diagnostic side in a bit, but I think that gives you an IVD overview of the types and how the classifications fit with those types. As we talk about IVDs, it's important to note that many of the medical device standards are still applicable. So when we talk about IVDs, there's still an expectation that you're using ISO 13485 for your general quality management system. You're using ISO 14971 for your risk assessments. But please note there are some specific standards that are IVD requirements. So whether we're talking about EN 13612, which is the performance evaluation of medical devices that are in vitro diagnostics, ISO 2360640, which is the stability of those reagents that are tied to an in vitro diagnostic. EN 13532, which is the self-testing requirements. Again, because they're going to a naive population, they have a set of standards that are unique to those. ISO 18113, that's specific to the labeling. That is an add-on from the typical EN 980. And finally, ISO 20916 is about clinical performance studies, especially using human specimens as part of good practice. So again, I'm not suggesting that these are the only standards. This is not an exhaustive list by any means, but these are some key ones that you need to focus on that we often see with our clients that they don't know about or haven't addressed in their design and development process that are unique to the IVD space. So we've talked about the types of IVDs, we've talked about the classification of those different types, and we've talked about some standards that are appropriate to IVDs. But I think it's really important to understand what kind of information is required when it comes to regulatory activities with IVDs. So what we've tried to do here in the next few slides is outline the clinical or the technical file contents that would be related or expected for an IVD. Now again, technical file, design dossier, or DHF, I will use the terms synonymously, but depending on the jurisdiction, that's where those terms are going to be used. So first, you would start out with a device description. Again, pretty self-explanatory. It's typically just a high-level overview description of the device, its scope, and any variants or configurations that might be included, as well as the accessories. Then your device history. So one of the things that we're seeing a lot in this space is that the regulators want to know where you're selling this device and how long it's been out there, but also how similar devices, so maybe devices supplied by competitors or products that are similar in the field, how long they've been out there and how many have been sold in the last few years, and whether or not specifically they have adverse events or complaints. Essential principles requirements. Now, this can be a single checklist that could be prepared for all geographies, but ultimately each jurisdiction may have a checklist that you need to fill out. So the idea here is that you are able to combine all of the pertinent jurisdictions and be able to say that you have substantiation for those requirements. Risk analysis and control summary. Again, at a minimum, the regulator wants to see a risk analysis and risk control measures that are governed by ISO 14971. And those risk requirements cover not only the design of the device, but also the manufacturing processes and the actual manufacturing sites itself. Next, labeling. So again, there's an expectation that all labels, including product labels and instructions for use, are included in your application or in your design dossier or technical file. Now, final content is often going to be revised during the review process, so it's not expected that you'll have a final printed format available, but you want to provide a draft, and prior to the end of your application process, you will give them the final set of labeling as you intend on applying it to your product. Declaration of conformity, again, consistent with the medical device requirements, but is just a declaration from the manufacturer of the standards and the appropriate guidances that you meet in those jurisdictions for your product. Self-explanatory. The next one is really where I've gotten into a lot more detail. And because it's the most important piece of the IVD, especially as it relates to regulatory review and what the regulators are looking for. And that's the performance. Now, typically, these are captured in what is called the performance evaluation report, although that may change depending on jurisdiction. It may be the summary of safety and effectiveness. It may be a summary of analytical performance. But in general, I'm going to refer to it as the performance evaluation report. The first thing you need to consider as part of the PER is the specimen type. Now again, you may have an intended specimen type that your final device is going to meet. So it may be finger stick whole blood. However, you may need to be able to access other samples that are not finger stick whole blood, that are in more availability, so that you can do your analytical testing. So your specimen type needs to show the equivalence between those, as well as any of the potential ranges for the analyte that you're looking for, and any maybe storage conditions, or specifically, are you using EDTA, heparin, citrate? So the specimen type becomes extremely valuable and needs to be proven so that not only can you say that your intended use specimen is met, but any of the supporting data and the specimens used to create that supporting data are there. Next one is analytical performance characteristics. This is going to be the meat of your PER. So there are a ton of different applications or performance characteristics that you could apply to your product, and I've just listed a few. But ultimately, depending on your product, depending on whether it's qualitative or quantitative, depending on if it's point of care, or if it's a laboratory method, you need to make sure that you're applying all of the appropriate performance characteristics. So accuracy, trueness, and precision. Is it getting a desired specificity or sensitivity that you need for the product to be usable? And again, that may be an evaluation of the risk benefit, or it might also be against what the gold standard is for other products that do this type of diagnostic. The traceability. Is it possible for you to understand how that product or that result was created from the instruments and the reagents that you have? And do they have appropriate calibrations and certifications around their product performance or their instrument performance? The measuring range and assay cutoff. Again, if you have a device or an IVD that you are saying, listen, typical range is from 0 to 50, you need to be able to prove that you can meet that range, and that if there are outliers, it doesn't create a dose hook effect, or it doesn't create something where your system will either interpret it as noise and give a false result, or that it's too high and it will start to actually affect your result from your IVD itself. Cross-reactivity and interfering substances. Again, much like where it comes to the high end of assay cutoff, if you have something in the sample that could potentially give a false reading. So let's say you're looking for a specific analyte, and you know that another target analyte, which is very similar molecule, might be present because it's something that happens, commonly. It's whether it's another disease type that's the same, or maybe it's something that a person could take as far as a drug and mask the analyte that you're targeting. Those are things that you need to be considering. Again, further on the performance piece is the clinical performance. And I will go into this a little bit more with the European requirements and the changes there with the IVDR. But ultimately, your clinical performance that's captured in the PER should be applicable clinical evidence, not only drawing on literature, post-market data, and your risk assessment, but any of the direct clinical studies that you've performed. And again, use the standards that apply to the direct studies for IVD products, but it's a combination of all those. Now, we don't want people to think that you have to do a bespoke, huge clinical trial for every IVD product out there. You want to find the appropriate balance between the literature, post-market data, and any data that you might have directly created from clinical studies to assess and show the risk benefit of your product. The next one, very important with IVDs, and that's stability. Because IVDs are going to have reagents and have components to them that may have different manufacturers, may have different, manufacturing processes, so on and so forth, you need to be able to show that the stability of the product will be maintained for the life of the product. And so that if you have something happen, whether it's the temperatures rise or that the transportation goes in a non-pressurized aircraft, that you have a study to prove that the result from your device or your IVD will be the same. Finally, if your IVD can include software, you need to make sure that you're doing your software verification and validation. IEC 62304 is a good place to start, but ultimately you want to have the evidence of the validation of your software, including any in-house or final evaluations, so that you can identify that into your labeling as it will be part of your IFU. Okay, so we've talked about the basics of an IVD, and I think we've taken the first half of this presentation to discuss that. And hopefully that doesn't come as a shock or it doesn't come as a surprise, but I want it to be the basis for your understanding as we talk about the regulatory updates. Again, Brand1 CKC does a lot of work in the IVD space, and what you've seen to this point is our experience and what our expectation is when we work with clients as to the content, the types, and the classifications of these IVDs. But now I'm going to focus on the regulatory updates. We start with Australia. So because Australia has positioned itself kind of ahead of the IVDR change in Europe, many of the things that are happening with IVDR are actually consistent with what is already in place by the TGA. So again, those changes that the IVDR align closely with the TGA system. So we don't expect any significant changes from the TGA itself. The one comment I will make is that TGA is very adamant about being close to alignment with FDA and US. So as we see changes in either of those two jurisdictions, we can expect or maybe think about whether or not Australia is going to make those similar changes. Now, one regulation that was clarified in the last, actually in late 2019, was the companion diagnostic guidance. And effectively, an explicit definition of a companion diagnostic was added because it was not specifically called out previously. So again, it has suggested that a companion diagnostic needs to have ARTG inclusion. Now, that was always kind of inferred, but it wasn't specifically presented in the regulations by the TGA. So that's the only change. And again, we don't anticipate, because the TGA was kind of out in front of the IVDR, we don't anticipate any other changes coming as a result of the IVDR being implemented. Next one, United States. So again, the US kind of has a different framework in this, but wants to be very closely aligned with other pertinent regulatory jurisdictions and regulatory authorities. So they are very aligned with the IVDR changes, in principle, but it hasn't necessarily trickled down into guidances or specific requirements from the FDA. And the same can be said by the other IMDRF participants. FDA and those IMDRF participants want to be aligned in their management of these products, so there is some connection. However, FDA still has their own unique set of requirements and expectations. I want to highlight two guidances that came to final right or final issuance in February of 2020. The first one is the recommendation for dual 510K and CLIA waiver application studies, and then the recommendations for the CLIA waiver applications for manufacturers of In Vitro Diagnostics. And I'll go into these individually. Okay, as part of the two regulatory updates from the US, the first one is on the CLIA waiver applications for IVD products. Effectively, there was a change a while back that they took the Section 5, which is demonstrating insignificant risk of an erroneous result dash accuracy, out of the CLIA waiver guidance. But as part of the 21st Century Cure Act, they needed to add some more language about the appropriate comparison. So effectively, they added the language to suggest appropriate use of a comparable performance between a waived user and a moderately complex laboratory user to demonstrate accuracy. So again, just confirming and giving more clarity as to the FDA's expectations when a clear waiver is made as to the comparison methodology. No other changes were made to this document. Second one was a very helpful one in that there was some recommendations that were made for a dual 510K CLIA waiver application studies. So again, this is really an efficiency from the FDA to suggest if you're generating data, you can potentially generate specific types of data to support a 510K and a CLIA waiver. So it gives specific recommendations for a single set comparison and reproducibility study design. And that is extremely valuable because, again, there are opportunities that you want to go forward with a CLIA waiver to gather more evidence, and then that will eventuate in a 510K. So this guidance helps to be more efficient in that you set up one single study to then inform both of those future applications. Now, the elephant in the room, as you can see by the slide, the picture on the slide here, is obviously the European Union. And we've gone through Australia, we've gone through the US, and those have been minor changes, mostly documentation and some clarity. But obviously, we all know that the IVDR is set to be implemented in May of 2022. Now, two things I'll mention here. The first one is that please remember that Brandwood CKC, in connection with QServe, presented a full webinar on IVD in late 2019. So please follow the link and you can get all of the detailed information about the IVDR from that. The other thing I will mention is that the IVDR is similar to the Australian regulations. So we've had a lot of experience from 2007 on in the expectations that are upcoming from the IVDR. And luckily, since the ratification of the IVDR, there hasn't been any changes, as we wouldn't expect. But just because there's been no changes, I think it's still worthwhile to have a bit of a brief update as to some of the major changes that are a part of the IVDR. So firstly, these, in my mind, are the top 8 changes that are happening as part of the IVDR that need to be a consideration of any manufacturer of an IVD device. So first of all, IVDR changes the definitions of IVDs. Compared to the IVDD, there is significant differences in what the definitions of IVDs are and where that relates to the classification routes. And obviously that ties into the classifications, which we discussed. Then the conformity routes. How do we actually bring these in front of a notified body or get an appropriate CE mark for this product to be marketed and sold in the European Union? These have changed. So it's important that you note that and read through and understand your conformity route for applications. The next one is sampling. Again, The expectation from a notified body isn't that they're going to sample every product all the time. They've gone to a much more pragmatic but more specific sampling program based on groups, classifications, and other specific information. So don't leave yourself in the dark, and definitely understand the sampling techniques that are going to be applied to your products when it comes to surveillance and maintaining your CE certificate. The next one is the GSPR. Again, the GSPR is replacing the essential requirements. Um, in content, they're very similar, but again, there's an expectation that there's a different way and different phrasing for these, so that you need to be able to address those through evidence, through substantiation, to make sure that the GSPR is covered. The clinical evidence requirements in IVDs, this is a huge change because there wasn't an expectation that clinical evidence would be talked about in such a manner. But in the performance evaluation report, there is an expectation that clinical evidence is addressed. And again, it's not to suggest that every client in the world has to go out and do clinical evidence on their IVDs, but it is to suggest that you have to have substantiation as to the evidence that you have on file for the clinical efficacy. The next one is post-market surveillance. Again, how companies market and continue to market their products is of the biggest importance to the MDR and the IVDR. Remember, most of these changes came out of post-market activities, whether it was recalls on metal-to-metal hips, implants, surgical meshes, so on and so forth. That's really what kicked off the whole push for the MDR and IVDR. And so there's a lot of language specific around post-market surveillance there. And then finally, the economic indicator operators, have changed, and the definitions of those are going to be important to you. So let's just go briefly through these, and then we'll wrap up the presentation. So from a classification perspective, again, this is very consistent with Australia. It's very consistent with a global viewpoint, which is lower classification means it's low personal risk, low public risk. Highest classification means it's high public risk, high personal risk. So as you can see, there are examples here. Really, those that aren't going to be life-threatening or aren't a public risk are going to be B's and A's and B's. But always remember that near patient or self-tests are classified in their own right, and they generally have a higher risk profile than those that are laboratory standalone IVDs. So keep that in mind. Next, your conformity routes change. Now, you can read through the slide, and again, I refer back to the presentation we did in 2019, but the big thing to remember here is that with these, you can see the lines on the bottom, most of these require notified body. So if we take anything away, we have to remember that prior to the IVDR, 20% of IVDs went through notified body review. With the ratification and the implementation of IVDR, 90% will require notified body review. So it is absolutely critical that you are engaging with a notified body, that you're putting your documentation together for your technical file, your design dossier, and you are ready to go when it comes to getting somebody to review your application so that you can get that CE mark. The clinical evidence, again, clinical evidence is really the clinical data and performance evaluation results put into this PER. Now, the expectation here is that it's a three-prong approach, and we put the stool as the metaphor here. So you have the three legs of the stool. You've got your scientific validity. So that means, okay, is that, from a literature and from, normal understanding of this, that this analyte is specific or associated with a specific clinical condition or physiological state. Your analytical performance, that's the next leg. Is this device able to correctly detect or measure the analyte that you're looking for? Okay. And then finally, the clinical performance, the last leg of the chair. Does that mean that your product is able to yield results that are going to have a clinical efficacy or have clinical correlation so that a diagnosis can be made and treatment decisions can be made from there. And it's one on itself does not a chair make, but you need all three of these, and that's where all of this information is getting added to the PER, the Performance Evaluation Report, to ensure that the intended clinical benefit and safety are met. Now, again, I will reiterate, because this is a question we get a lot, does this mean I need to do clinical studies? And the answer is maybe, but generally, you should, especially if you've been marketing this product under the IVDD, you should have plenty of evidence from your real world and your post-market surveillance to be able to support your clinical performance and your overall product performance. So in most cases, it's just justifying that. In some cases, especially those that classifications have changed or that it hasn't been on the market that long or it is extremely novel and high risk, you may need to consider clinical studies. Last one that I'm going to present here on the EU is the IVD economic operators. And this is important because these are new definitions. I mean, although the terms have been used, these are new well, I shouldn't say requirements, but they are new expectations of the IVDR. Again, legal manufacturer, we knew what the legal manufacturer was, but ultimately they're overall responsible for the device they market, and they place it onto the market. An authorized representative is those that are able to act on your behalf. An importer is somebody who places a device from a third country onto the EU market, and a distributor makes those devices available. Now, again, we all kind of had the understanding of these definitions, and we all kind of used them previous to the IVDR, but now it's defined and delineated specifically. And I think the interesting part is on the authorized representative, because there's much more liability assigned to authorized reps under the IVDR. So in summary, again, there hasn't been any changes since the IVDR came out. I think we're learning more and more about this, and we're learning more and more about how notified bodies are going to implement this. But the biggest takeaway here is if you haven't done anything yet, you're going to be in for a shock. You need to gather your evidence to support the GSPRs. Again, the old essential requirements, but you need to have clinical evidence to show substantiation of those GSPR requirements. Does that mean you need to supplement data with additional studies? Potentially. And again, if you're talking about new situations where you've had a difference in classification or you're dealing with an extremely novel device, you may. But in any case, you need to justify why or why not you're doing no clinical study or doing a clinical study. Remember, there's no grandfathering opportunities. So once this is implemented, it is expected that all manufacturers will follow. And we, as I said before, we are learning more and more about how the notified bodies are going to implement this. And I expect that this will be a consistent and continuous learning opportunity for manufacturers and notified bodies. As of today, there are only 4 notified bodies accredited to the IVDR, and that's DECRA, BSI UK, BSI Netherlands, and TÜV Sud. There are more that will get accredited. There are a lot that we're doing reviews under the IVDD that are going away. So just remember, and my biggest takeaway, again, besides if you haven't done anything yet, you're in for a shock, is you've only got 4 notified bodies so far. You've got products that were only 20% getting notified body review are now going to 90% are getting notified body review. And with only 4 notified bodies, you don't have to have many math skills to understand that is going to be a pinch point. And so you need to get prepared as soon as possible. Okay, so on this, I wanted to just briefly go through some of the questions that we had talked about before, and some of the questions that I received from you guys that have subscribed to this webinar. So I'll go through these individually, but again, I will ask that if you have any questions after this or as a result of listening to this, please reach out. You can reach out to the help@brandwoodckc.com, and we will address every question that comes to us. So the first question we received was, how far will EU notified or EU IVDR CE marks be accepted in international markets outside of the US? It's a good question. Um, the answer is it's going to be consistent with the IVD. So if there are jurisdictions that are accepting your CE mark for IVD products right now, that's going to be maintained consistent. So places like Singapore, places like Saudi Arabia, there are countries that have specifically set up their regulatory processes to observe and take in people from foreign accredited notified bodies or accredited regulators as part of their application process. Now, I will always say that having an IVDR, even if it's not going to get you an expedited pathway or a immediate clearance in these regulators, is the same basic set of documentation that you will need for any of these other jurisdictions. So you may not get the efficiency in the application process itself, but you will have the documentation to support applications or regulatory processes, whether it's Australia, Canada, US, whatever. It may require some small tweaking, but it's not a huge difference. The next question we had was, are there any regulatory issues related to less common applications of cell-based diagnostic measurements? Um, there haven't been any recent developments in this space. Again, I think we've been focused on a large scale change with the IVDR that there was, people were kind of put off by making smaller changes and putting out smaller guidances specific to cell-based diagnostic measurements. But we know there's a lot of movement in the space. We know that there's been a lot of requests for industry input from regulators. So please keep uh, letting us know, and we will be definitely putting out information as we hear it on Brentwood CKC website, through our blogs, or potentially doing a webinar if things change in the space. Um, the standards to be followed for analytical performance is per the IVDR. If a performance study is conducted as per ISO 20916, will it be accepted in the IVDR? Yes, I mean, effectively, there's no specific guidance or no specific, this ISO standards required or not required. That ISO standard, which is 20916, is a very good indication and meets the general requirements for notified bodies that are reviewing under the IVDR. Now, it will always come back to your documentation and your risk analysis as to how that process was accomplished and whether it was significant enough to mitigate the risk. And that will be up for your notified body to determine. But in general, that's a good place to start. I would definitely recommend the use of that standard as you think about clinical studies or studies that are on IVDs using human analyte samples. The last question I had was whether or not there are any other standards that could be followed in the analytical performance space. And we've listed some IVD standards there in the slide set, but one thing I will mention is that there are a lot of other resources out there that discuss specifically, what expectations are for clinical performance, for clinical efficacy, so on and so forth. Now, depending on the classification of device, there may be some consensus standards out there. There may be some minimum performance requirements that are out there. But one of the unexpected places that you can get a better understanding for performance and analytical performance is the WHO website. So if you look at some of their expectations for pre-qualification, they are very specific in their expectations when it comes to analytical performance. And so that can be a very good template for you to use as you're considering the analytical performance for your device. So please have that in mind. So with that, I will draw to a close. I want to thank you for listening through this presentation. Again, please continue to sign up for our webinars. You can always view these things after on demand at brandwoodckc.com/videos. And if you have any questions, reach out. Help at Brandwood CKC. You've got the online, you've got our website, you've got our Facebook tag, you've got our LinkedIn. Basically, any method of communicating with you, we will get back to you. So thank you.